Good morning, everybody. This is John Dowding from WSAV.com now with another episode of All Politics Are Local. As always, we're joined this week by Kellie Myers from Washington, D.C., our WSAV Washington correspondent. Hey, Kellie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. All right. We have a bunch of things we have to talk about. So many things change in just a week's time. Honestly, it feels like forever ago when we last spoke last Monday. But
It really does.
in that time, so many things have changed. Hopefully for the better in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. First off, let's just talk about some things that came up this weekend with the Surgeon General's warning. He was pretty much saying we need to really prepare for the worst to come this week. And I would also say anticipating into next week too. It's probably going to overflow into next week as well, where, excuse me, a lot of states are going to be seeing those peak numbers of that curve that everybody's talking about. He was also saying that it's comparable to a Pearl Harbor 9/11 situation. So, Kellie, let's just really talk about what does this warning mean for us at home, us, just bunkering down, getting our masks, only going out when we have to. What does this warning mean for us?
Yeah, I mean, what we heard over the weekend, like you said, from the daily White House coronavirus task force briefings, was that Dr. Deborah Birx came out and said the next 2 weeks are going to be extremely important. She said, quote, "This is the moment to not be going to the grocery store, not going to the pharmacy, but doing everything you can to keep your family and your friends safe." That's what she said on Saturday during the coronavirus task force briefing. So, like you said, these next 2 weeks are crucial in this fight against the coronavirus pandemic. We're seeing it in some places, hopefully decreasing. We're getting hopeful news out of Italy and maybe hopeful news out of Washington state, places that we first saw this before it started spreading to other parts of the country. And we're seeing maybe not as many deaths in New York. They're hoping to contain this, but saying that we have to do everything we can to uh, keep that, flatten that curve, keep that number down, and continue to keep that number down. And it's a time like we're seeing for Holy Week, for people going out and maybe wanting to go to church. We're seeing that message for them, or some religious leaders are saying for allowing them to still go to church, but a lot of people are saying don't do that, stay at home, do the online mass. So it's an interesting time for this critical time to come up with so many people wanting to observe this religious holiday. But again, they're stressing the importance of this, and now stressing the importance of the mask to not only protect yourself but protect others while you're out and about wearing this mask too. So the biggest message coming here, coming from Washington, D.C., coming from the White House, is to stay at home. Very, very critical in these next 2 weeks.
And my biggest question throughout this whole kind of this conversation that the Surgeon General brought up over the weekend is, they're talking about seeing obviously when you get to the peak, that's when you start seeing a decline in cases. When okay, we've seen we've seen a decline in the amount of cases and the amount of deaths. But my biggest question is, and hopefully you can answer this from Washington's perspective, how are they defining that peak? Is it a nationwide peak? Because they were saying certain states may reach that peak number before others. They may reach them after. We've just been recently hearing about an increase in cases in Louisiana and places like that. So how are they looking to define and be able to really differentiate and understand whether or not we've kind of hit that midway point in the pandemic here in the States?
And that's a good point. And I would have to look back at all the data they're sharing in some of these briefings, but I think they are looking at overall, where is our peak on this? And they're saying, I think, and I, like you said, it's a good point. Different states could be hitting it at different times, but I think they're looking at these really highly populated areas, places like New York City, and we're looking at when they're going to hit their peak. And I think they're maybe likely to hit it in the next 2 weeks or just before the end of April. So I think they're looking at that and trying to say that they can contain it in these big cities, contain it overall in these rural areas. But it's a great point to bring up. Where is this point, and when do we reach it? And when can people get back outdoors and get back to normal life? I think that's what everyone's wondering. And I think, like we said last week too, with Dr. Fauci saying the virus predicts the timeline, we don't predict the timeline. I think everyone trying to say when this will end or when we'll be able to get back to work, we just don't know. It just really depends on how much we flatten this curve and how much we can keep those numbers down.
And I think kind of switching gears here, talking about normal life, it really is extremely important to keep the numbers down, obviously, because that's how we'll get over all of this. Part of some problems that have been discussed publicly have been obviously how our lawmakers are working to, be able to pass legislation, work together cohesively with local, state, and federal officials to try and figure out a response to this. But I mean, when you look at it from a CDC standpoint, all these lawmakers gathering in one particular place isn't safe for those people. Specifically in South Carolina, the they're having a mandatory. They're trying to get a mandatory quarantine at home order for all of state legislators because they recently had to hold a special session to meet. And so they want to make sure that they're not taking anything back home to their communities after meeting in South Carolina. And South Carolina is one of the only states in the country, one of a handful, that still does not have a stay-at-home order. So, coming from the Washington standpoint of we have over 400 representatives in the House of Representatives, and we have 100 senators in the Senate. All of those people getting together, and a lot of them are in that high-risk age group. Has there been any continued or further discussions about remote voting, about ways that they're trying to work to protect themselves while they're meeting in Washington?
Yeah, and that's a really great point. I mean, we're looking at the calendar here. 2 weeks from now is when your lawmakers, are set to come back to Washington, D.C. on April 20th. And we're not sure right now if that's going to be the case. I mean, DC and other places still have social distancing in place. I mean, the 30 days to slow the spread is still in effect, and that's the White House and CDC guidelines. That's still in effect through the end of April. So for them to return with these guidelines and these restrictions in place, I don't know if that will happen. But we are shifting into a phase 4. Potentially, Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate and the White House are trying to negotiate a deal on phase 4. That will need to be voted on. We saw that they were here to vote on phase 3 and then left. So will they be coming back? Will they do the remote voting and digital virtual voting? That remains to be seen. Or will they end up coming back here in early May? There's so many questions with this left unanswered. And also, like you said, with different states addressing this in different ways, and how Dr. Fauci was saying over the weekend that he doesn't know why there hasn't been a national standard. Why isn't it the same across the board? So there's so many different areas, so many different ways people are addressing this. There's just really a lot of unanswered questions.
One of the questions, hopefully you can answer for us, is talking about before we head out for today, is looking at other further legislation that we can expect. Obviously, like you said last week, and how other people said last week in Washington, that first stimulus package was the first of many that they're anticipating. So what have you been hearing? How close are we to other bills? Obviously, you just said they were starting up on one and then they went home for this Easter recess. But what else can we expect? What else are we hearing?
So I talked with South Carolina Congressman Joe Cunningham last week about what he would like to see in a phase 4 and where the negotiations were going at this point. Because even last week, and it's changed since then, but just to catch you up, Republican leadership was just saying, let's wait and see. Even Larry Kudlow, the president's chief economic advisor, was saying, let's wait and see how phase 3 works, how much relief it brings, get these checks out to families. Let's just see if it's working before we go and dish out another how many $1 trillion in these stimulus packages. But for Democrats like Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she's making promises with Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York to say, we need to give them more money. We need to get more money going. We need to kind of get ahead of this before we get behind it. So now it seems as the weekend shifted on, they are coming to more of a negotiating table and working on some sort of infrastructure package. The president, you probably have heard, he wants an infrastructure package. Republicans are working on that. What Joe Cunningham said is definitely something for small business, for the food and bev industry, for the tourism industry that's hard hit in his area. People will be definitely still looking at that. We're seeing the small business help kind of starting to flow out from phase 3. We'll see if that's enough. A lot of questions coming up from small businesses, from workers, from families, the support they need. So I think you can probably expect another phase coming here out of Congress. Again, when that will be voted on, coming back to our previous conversation, we don't know how that looks. They're still on the early phase, I would say, of negotiating this. But it does look like something infrastructure, something to further look at small businesses, and just look at the areas that are being impacted the hardest from this outbreak.
When you say infrastructure, what specifically are you speaking about? Because when I think of infrastructure, I'm thinking roads, transportation, stuff like that. What
Yeah.
infrastructural points are they discussing?
And that was something, and I did talk with like North Carolina Congressman G.K. Butterfield. He's a Democrat, another Democrat along with Cunningham. He said they were looking at infrastructure, roads and bridges, construction jobs, which was a question I thought, how would it be safe for them to go back out anyhow? But they could be creating jobs in those areas because you do see some workers still out there doing that. But then he also mentioned something like rural broadband. That's something that would be included in this, which is something that we're facing as we talk here. Some places, some rural communities can't do this either for work or for kids' classes to continue their learning. So that would be something that would also be addressed in this package, or Democrats hope would be addressed.
So basically, using infrastructure as a way to kind of shore up the economy from that standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's also been a sticking point for the administration. It's something that the president has always gone back to that he wants to do. So I think this is also him for a chance for them to kind of work on that promise, as well as delivering on that, maybe get another jump start to the economy, because that's a really big backbone of his administration and his campaign is to kind of keep this economy going.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of giving me a little bit of 2008, 2009, early Obama administration vibes when obviously we were in the middle of the Great Recession, and he used the infrastructure as a way to shore up the economy, and rest is history. Hopefully, it did help. It did help, obviously. But thank you so much. That's all the time we have for right now. But we'll be back again next week. So, but thank you as always, Kellie, for joining us and helping us talk through all of this and figure all this out, especially right now during such a critical and important time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course, you guys can see more of Kellie's stories right now on our website at wsav.com/Washington. And you can see more of our episodes of All Politics Are Local at the same spot, or you can go to wsav.com/All Politics Are Local. As always, I'm John Dowding. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again next week on All Politics Are Local.